Hello, my name is Naiomi Metallic. I am a law professor at Dalhousie Law School in Halifax. So here's a presentation that I've prepared about the current state of self-government in Canada today. And if I was to answer that question, what is the current state? I would say that at the moment there's not a lot of recognition in Canadian law or society for Indigenous self-government. However, I do think that we are on the brink of some important changes that I think are coming, and I will discuss that more in a little bit. In a nutshell, there is some recognition of self-government in Canada at the moment, but it can only be implemented really with the permission of Canada, and usually this is after decades of negotiation. Beyond that, there's some other Canadian laws that do recognize that First Nations can have greater control over some of their affairs. But this recognition is really piecemeal. And many communities aren't implementing these laws even though they're available. And that can be for a number of reasons, which we'll talk a little bit more about after. Also, there's not a lot of resources available for communities to implement self-government at this point, and having real capacity for developing self-government is really important. We'll get to that a bit more too later. But as I said earlier, I do think there are a number of things that are going to be happening or potentially going to be happening that could really change the picture of self-government in Canada. So before I get into the main presentation, let me go over some key concepts that I think are important to have in mind when having a discussion about self-government. So the first one is self-determination. Self-determination is related to self-government, but it's a broader idea. It's a concept that is developed in international law, and basically it's a very simple concept. It's a concept that peoples, nations, should have the right to choose their own destinies. And in Canada, for First Nations and Inuit and Métis, it's a recognition that they have the right to negotiate the terms of their relationship with Canada and choose governmental structures that meet their needs. And so really self-government is actually sort of an offset of self-determination. It's more specific. Self-determination is the right to choose. Self-government is a sort of particular choice. It's a choice about rulemaking. So really self-government, the concept is that it's the extent to which a nation is able to enforce its own rules, to resolve disputes, to problem solve, and to establish its own governing institutions to carry out these tasks. Sort of opposite to these concepts is self-administration. And what I mean by that is when programs are downloaded by different governments to Indigenous groups like First Nations, so the delivery of programs and services are downloaded to them, but really it's another government, usually the federal government, that is making all the key decisions about which programs are delivered, under what terms and conditions, and what funding is received for those services. And I would say my assessment is that most First Nations in Canada are under self-administration rather than self-government. And that is through a combination of a few things, the Indian Act, but there's lots of areas really in terms of essential services where there's nothing in the Indian Act covering that, and instead it's federal policies that dictate what are federal policies and funding agreements that dictate the program terms and conditions that First Nations are supposed to follow. If you want to understand this better, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this in this particular presentation, but there is another video on my YouTube channel where I explain in depth what I mean by self-administration and why I think it's such a big problem. And so if you look on YouTube, the presentation is called Problems with Service Delivery on First Nations Reserves. So I recommend that to you if you want to know more about this topic. Two last key concepts. Aboriginal law Often Aboriginal law is thought to just refer to constitutional rights, Section 35, Aboriginal treaty rights, and it does include that, but it also actually more broadly refers to the ways that Canadian law can apply to, sometimes with either a different process or different results to Indigenous people. And so it's kind of the intersection between Canadian law and how it impacts on Indigenous people. And then there is the concept of Indigenous law, which is a reference to specifically the laws, customs, and traditions of the Indigenous peoples of Canada themselves. And there's a lot more work happening these days at different institutions, but in particular the University of Victoria. They have an Indigenous Law Resource Center, and they are doing amazing work working with First Nations to rediscover and reinvigorate their laws. So I recommend looking them up if that's an area of interest to you. Okay, so let's start off with kind of getting into the context of discussing where we are at with self-government in Canada. So I'd say with the bottom line here is that prior to the arrival of Europeans, the nations who lived in what is now known as Canada were self-governing. They had their own legal systems and traditions, and they applied their own Indigenous laws. Okay? And the other key point to remember here is that these were never given up after the arrival of Europeans. Sometimes people think that for some reason they were, but they were not. In fact, in the first couple of 100 years after contact, the Europeans, the British in particular, recognized this fact and interacted with the Indigenous nations here accordingly. So examples of this that we can point to are things like the peace and friendship treaties here that offered British protection and friendship to the Indigenous signatories in exchange for their agreement to make peace and not side with the French. But these treaties recognize that these were sovereign Indigenous nations that had their own laws and were able to make decisions for themselves. And there was a recognition within these treaties as well that Indigenous groups control their own internal affairs. As well, with the Haudenosaunee, and you see on the screen, the two-row wampum belt was ratified between them and the British. And the whole idea around the two-row wampum belt, what it symbolizes is two boats traveling together, one a ship, one a canoe, traveling together side by side, but both remaining on their in their separate rows, or traveling in their own separate directions, but together. And that is supposed to symbolize that both would manage their own internal affairs and not harming or encroaching on the others, on the other. And this idea of the two-row wampum belt was actually taken up more broadly the year after the Royal Proclamation of 1763 was signed at the Treaty of Niagara, which was signed, I believe, with 20 different nations, and they came from as far east as what we now know as Nova Scotia to the Northwest Territories, and even Indigenous groups came from what we now know as southern U.S. And they all ratified this treaty, and the concept of the wampum belt was used, it was upheld, it was actually shown by the representative of the Crown to the Indigenous groups who gathered to symbolize the idea of how they would be interacting with each other. And the two-row wampum belt recognizes that Indigenous groups would maintain their own control over their own affairs. However, this changed, this sort of recognition of Indigenous self-government and control changed around the time when Europeans decided that they wanted to settle here. You see, at first, the Europeans who came here were primarily interested in finding goods to bring back to Europe to trade. But over time, the objective changed to one of settling these in this territory. And that's when things changed, and this myth started to be peddled, I would say, which over time has taken a hold in Canadian law and is actually still part of it today. And the myth is this, that as a Christian, Caucasian, civilized race, by simply finding this territory full of brown, heathen, uncivilized people, the Christian race automatically got control of all the lands and got to make all the decisions over these lands and the people who were already here. This myth is called the Doctrine of Discovery. And in fact, it is still impacting, or you could say poisoning, Canadian law and the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people here. But maybe not for much longer. And I'll talk about that more later. Okay, so moving on. So we're talking about the period from 1867 to 1973, and in this period was one of primarily of denial. From about the time of Confederation to about the early 1970s, the right of self-government and pretty much all other rights of Indigenous people were denied and ignored. This is the period where Canada attempted a cultural genocide to assimilate our nations into the mainstream culture and destroy our language, cultures, and legal traditions. And in that pursuit, Canada relied on several policies and laws, as well as provinces. And I'm not going to repeat all of those many laws and policies here. I expect that many of you who are watching this already know these all too well. But if anyone watching this is not familiar with these, please go read the first chapter of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's final report. It's easy to find. It's online, www.trc.ca. You'll find it under final report. Read the first chapter. It's 26 pages long, and it's an eye-opening read for those who are not familiar with this history. Okay, so let's turn from that dark chapter to where things started to change in Canadian culture. Okay, so the turning point started with the 1969 White Paper. So a little bit of an explanation. By this point, Canada, post-World War II, as is nations across the world, started to be more concerned with human rights and concepts of equality. But these sort of early ideas of equality, we would call them, impoverished compared to how we think about equality today. But the early concepts of equality saw equality as everyone being the same, being colorblind and treating everybody the same. But the problem with that concept is that it ignores the fact that we all carry with us certain worldviews that are influenced by the cultures that we come up in. So if the dominant culture sees equality in a particular way, then they just want everyone else basically to be exactly like them. And that's not true equality. Really, that's the definition of assimilation. So true equality is about recognizing, celebrating, and accommodating differences. And we recognize that better today than we did back then. But that's the way it was back in the 60s. And with this mindset, in 1969, the government of Pierre Elliott Trudeau, with his Minister of Indian Affairs, Jean Chrétien, proposed to treat Indians equally by removing their Indian status, by phasing out reserves and treaties, and finally the objective was that the federal government would no longer have any responsibilities to the Indigenous peoples, and that they would sort of gradually, or not so gradually, be absorbed into the mainstream. Perhaps Canada wasn't expecting this, although you think it might have. Indigenous people did not react favorably, and that's putting it mildly, to this proposal. Rightly so, they saw the proposal as the ultimate form of assimilation. Okay, this fueled a national resistance movement in a way that had not been seen before. And this is when we start to see the emergence of Indigenous political organizations and emerging. So we get the Indian National Brotherhood, which later would become the AFN, as well as a number of regional bodies. The Union of Nova Scotia Indians here, the Union of British Columbia Indians, etc., etc. So these organizations started fighting in the courts for recognition of their inherent rights in the early 70s. And in 1973, one of these cases got to the Supreme Court of Canada. The case that got to the Supreme Court was called Calder versus British Columbia, and it involved the Nisga'a Nation, who asked the British Columbia courts whether Aboriginal title continued to exist in law, independent of things like the Royal Proclamation Act of 1763. And this case was primarily focused on Aboriginal title, so Indigenous peoples' claims to their territories, not so much on self-government. So the way that the decision was decided was that 3 judges found that Aboriginal title continued to exist. However, over time it had been extinguished. Another 3 judges also found that it continued to exist, but that it had not been extinguished over time. And then the 7th judge decided the case on an entirely different procedural basis. So the result was that the Nisga'a lost. However, the impact of the judge's ruling, essentially 6 judges finding that Aboriginal title continued past the assertion of sovereignty, was really significant at the time. It caused Canada, the government of Canada, to reverse its long-standing policy not to negotiate land claims with Indigenous people. And then following this, Indigenous people continued to push for the recognition of their inherent rights. When news came that Canada wanted to repatriate the Constitution, there were concerns by Indigenous people that this may have an impact on their relationship with the British Crown and their treaties with the British Crown. And so there was a move to ensure that Indigenous inherent rights were protected within this Constitution. And initially, there was nothing in the initial drafts of the Constitution Act 1982 that talked about inherent rights or Aboriginal rights. So Indigenous people had to lobby. There was a whole movement called the Constitutional Express, where Indigenous peoples from throughout the country got on trains, descended on Ottawa, and engaged in direct action and protested, so to get the lawmakers and the provinces and the federal government to listen. And that did have the result of getting recognition within the Constitution Act 1982. So this is where we get Section 35. It's in Part 2 of the Constitution Act. Section 1 of Section 35 states that the existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada are hereby recognized and affirmed. So that was another incredible milestone on the journey to having our inherent rights recognized. You'll notice that the wording is quite broad. What does it mean, existing Aboriginal and treaty rights? So the initial idea with the Constitution Act was that there would be further amendments to the Constitution to flesh out what parts of it meant, including Section 35, and to really spell out what the rights recognized were. However, there were a couple of attempts to amend the Constitution in the 80s and the 90s. The very first set of meetings about amending the Constitution did not include Indigenous people at all. The amendments called the Meech Lake Accord were about other issues, and in order to be passed, they had to be unanimously supported. However, Elijah Harper, a Cree member of the legislature of Manitoba, ended up putting a stop to those amendments and preventing the Manitoba legislature from unanimously passing it. And what his symbol, or what his act of standing up really drew attention to the need to involve Indigenous people in constitutional amendments. And so after the Meech Lake Accord failed. The next attempts, which were called the Charlottetown Accord, to amend the Constitution, did involve Indigenous people. Unfortunately, the Charlottetown Accord proposal was put to a national referendum and it failed. There were other amendments proposed. It was a whole suite of things, not just Indigenous stuff. But the Indigenous inherent rights amendments would have been significant. These would have added a new Section 35(1) to the Constitution Act to recognize that Aboriginal peoples of Canada have the inherent right of self-government within Canada. And beyond that, this amendment would have specified that Aboriginal peoples' jurisdiction includes their ability to safeguard and develop their languages, cultures, economies, identities, institutions, and traditions, and to develop, maintain, and strengthen their relationship with their lands, waters, and environment. So that was a fairly broad recognition of Indigenous jurisdiction. But unfortunately, as I said, the Charlottetown Amendments were not successful in changing the Constitution. Another last point I want to add about what was proposed in the Charlottetown Accord about self-government was that it provided that for the first 5 years, these amendments wouldn't take effect unilaterally. An Indigenous group couldn't unilaterally assert its self-government. This was in order to give the governments time to negotiate with the Indigenous people to come out with new modern treaties and other agreements on their self-government rights. But it recognized that they put a limit on that, and after 5 years, if nothing happened or things were slow, Indigenous groups would be able then to unilaterally assert their right to self-government, which is quite interesting. But yes, as I say, it wasn't, the Charlottetown Accord ultimately failed. So because lawmakers were not able to amend the Constitution Act in Section 35, its interpretation of what kind of rights were protected by Section 35 fell to the courts. And so it's been through decisions, primarily from the Supreme Court of Canada, that we have come to find out what's in the Section 35 box, if you will. So if we take stock of, the impact that Section 35 has had over the last 36 years since it's been in force, it has had impact, there's no question. The Supreme Court has said that the primary purpose of Section 35 is reconciliation, the pre-existence of Aboriginal societies with the sovereignty of the Crown. Since the court started deciding Aboriginal rights cases, it has found and developed tests for Aboriginal rights, for treaty rights, for Aboriginal title, as well as the duty to consult. One thing we see from the development of these cases is that they do tend to put a heavy onus on the Indigenous parties. The Indigenous claimant has to prove their Aboriginal right, their treaty right or title, and the courts tend to put out fairly stringent tests that require the claimants to put forth significant historical evidence of their claim, dating back sometimes to pre-contact, depending on the right in question. And if an Indigenous group is able to prove all of that, then the onus shifts, and then it's the Crown has the opportunity to prove that the right no longer exists through extinguishment, or that any infringement of that right is reasonably justified. Yes, and one thing that we've also seen in the cases to date, and I'll come back to this, is that the Supreme Court has been pretty reluctant to weigh in on the issue of self-government. So the TRC, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, has weighed in on whether it thinks Section 35 has been effective in achieving reconciliation. Reconciliation, as they define it, as respectful relations between Indigenous peoples and and Canadian society and the Canadian state. And the TRC has been fairly critical of the jurisprudence, the case law that has come out under Section 35. They've pointed out that the main cases decided by the Supreme Court basically take Crown sovereignty for granted. In fact, there's an early case from the Supreme Court that says straight out, but the sovereignty of the British Crown was never in question. So it never gets poked at. And, in other words, the case law is still really steeped in that myth of the Doctrine of Discovery that I talked about earlier. It accepts that the Crown somehow magically or automatically gained control of all lands and jurisdiction in Canada. People who are critical of the Supreme Court Section 35 case law, including the TRC, further point out that because the case law is based on this myth, the test and the requirements that have been developed by the courts really do favor the Crown more than they do Indigenous people. They say you can see this in the very difficult test that has been developed for proving Aboriginal rights and title, and the fact that the Crown is able to prove extinguishment, that the right no longer exists, and also the very broad rights or ability that the Crown, that the court recognized for the Crown to be able to infringe these rights. The words of the TRC are that Section 35 should not be seen as a means to subjugate Aboriginal people to an absolute sovereign Crown. And that's how they see the jurisprudence pretty much to date. And they say in Canada, the law must cease to be a tool for the dispossession and dismantling of Aboriginal societies. So they're pretty critical of the job that Section 35 has done to date. Okay, to come back to the Crown's or the Supreme Court of Canada's position on self-government, which I said is the court is really reluctant, has been really reluctant to find rights to self-government. So to explain a bit more about this, in a case called Pamajewon, which was a claim by an Indigenous group in Canada. I believe it was Haudenosaunee, or maybe wrong, I think it was Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, group who were putting forth rights to engage or rights to manage and regulate gaming within their community. In this case, it was the first time the court had to hear a claim, an Aboriginal rights claim to self-government. And they said that there wasn't a general right to self-government protected under Section 35, but there could be specific rights to self-government, but these had to be proved on a case-by-case basis, just like any other Aboriginal right. So that would mean showing that the right, the self-government right that was being claimed, is the continuation of a pre-contact practice. So that means that any jurisdiction, Indigenous jurisdiction from that right to self-government is pretty narrowly defined and has to be tied to a distant past. So this sort of test that was developed for self-government has been criticized several times over by many scholars who have suggested that this has really frozen the right to self-government to the distant past, and that does not provide a workable model of self-governance for Indigenous communities today. And since that case, the case is from 1996, lower courts in Canada have generally taken a narrow approach. There has been very few cases. There hasn't really, to my knowledge, there's been very few, if any, that have found a specific right to self-government. And on a couple of occasions, at least, the Supreme Court has passed up opportunities to hear a case that would make it revisit its definition of self-government or how to interpret the right. So the ultimate point here is that there has been very little movement on self-government in the courts up until this point. However, on the political side of things, there has been more activity. So we're going to turn to that now. Okay, so So the first time that the Canadian government really considered moving forward on Indigenous self-government was in fact in the early 1980s. Canada had appointed a special committee to study Indian self-government, and the committee produced a groundbreaking report, and it's often called the Penner Report, named after the chair of the committee, and the title page you see there on the screen. The report is actually pretty amazing. The first time I read it in 2014, I thought it could have been written in 2014. You really get the sense that things have not really changed, and the things that the report was being really critical of have not changed. The report was really critical of the model of programmed evolution or self-administration that I described earlier. It said that it wasn't working, and the approach that the Department of Indian Affairs was taking to this was really holding Indigenous communities back. And what it called for was a whole new act that would recognize Indigenous nations, allow them to organize as they see fit, not just into Indian Act bands, and it would provide them self-government jurisdiction over a whole bunch of areas related to their internal affairs. It also recommended that there would also have to be legislation formalizing how funding agreements would be transferred to self-governing bands. And this vision would allow groups to ease into self-government as they became ready to do so. It would provide them capacity building funds to do so as well. And it would allow for the Indian Act to be phased out over time. So when the report was tabled, the Liberal government, although it had some issues with it, were receptive to it, and in fact did introduce a bill. Maybe it wasn't completely, it didn't perhaps follow the recommendations in the report perhaps as robustly as the report suggested, but nonetheless a Indian Self-Government Act was tabled. But shortly after this time, there was a general election and change in government. The Conservative government of Brian Mulroney replaced the Pierre Trudeau Liberal government, and the Mulroney government was not interested in pursuing further self-government. They were more interested in pursuing an enhanced form of self-administration. So that got sort of scrapped, that act. And we go through a period where self-government is coming up in the context of constitutional debates, which I described earlier, around the Charlottetown Accord and amending the Constitution. But as I said earlier, the Accord wasn't successful. So the next time the government sort of picks up self-government for Indigenous people again, outside of constitutional issues, is about 10 years later. So after the failed Charlottetown Accord, now we have another election in 92, and a liberal government comes to power again, and this time under Jean Chrétien. And Jean Chrétien and his party had campaigned that it wanted to do more to recognize Indigenous self-government. And so it introduced their approach to the implementation of the inherent right and the negotiation of Aboriginal self-government. This is often called the Inherent Rights Policy for short. And so Canada came up with this policy in 1995. One thing to point out about the policy is that it came out before the Royal Commission Report of Aboriginal Peoples, and I will talk about the significance of that report and its recommendations a little later. But I will note that the government really didn't change much after the RCAP report came out to adjust to its recommendations. And so the inherent rights policy after RCAP sort of generally stays in the form that it is, and it has stayed in this form for 20 plus years. And it has been the main instrument recognizing Indigenous self-government in Canada. It's a policy, it's not a law, and let's review some of the aspects of it. Okay, so the policy does recognize that Aboriginal people have the inherent right to self-government. and it recognizes in the policy about 21 areas of core jurisdiction, where it's prepared to find that Indigenous people should be entirely self-governing, and if there's conflict generally between Aboriginal laws and provincial or federal laws, the idea, although it still has to be negotiated, is that Indigenous laws on these sort of internal areas would be upheld over the other laws. There's some other secondary categories where the government felt that there would have to be further negotiation with the provinces in terms of if there was conflicts of laws. But 21 core areas, you can see them on the screen, ranging from education, health, social services, natural resource management. So things that are really, I think we could say, internal to the community. So that's a significant recognition of jurisdiction over a whole number of areas. Problem with the policy, however, is that unlike sort of what was proposed in the Charlottetown Accord before, that after a certain period of time, Indigenous people would be able to unilaterally assert jurisdiction over these areas. The policy, the inherent rights policy, doesn't provide for that. It doesn't recognize that. Essentially, if there's going to be exercise of self-government, it has to be negotiated by Canada. And the policy, if you read through the whole thing, is essentially entirely dictated by Canada. How it starts, what the stages are, a variety of things. All of that is dictated by Canada from the outset, and there's no opportunity to negotiate that. Okay, so that's the policy in a nutshell. There's more that can be said about it, but let's talk a little bit about what implementation of the inherent rights policy has looked at in the last 25 plus years or so. So there have been 22 self-government agreements that have been successfully concluded, and that's about with 36 communities in total. Now, the self-government policy recognizes that you can either pair the policy with ongoing land claim negotiations under the comprehensive claims policy, and that's what most Indigenous groups that are negotiating do. And so 18 of the self-government agreements have been in the context of comprehensive claim agreements. Although there's some real severe restrictions on who can negotiate comprehensive claims, and I'll come back to that in a bit. There can also be standalone self-government agreements that can be negotiated, and there's been 3 of those negotiated to date, and what's called sectoral agreements, and those are standalone agreements on simply one area or 2. There's only been one signed in 1999 that's been recognized, and that's one on self-government over education on reserves in Nova Scotia. And so the problem with this being a policy is, and so you can see that it's been pretty slow, and there hasn't actually been a lot of groups that have actually been able to conclude self-government agreements. And it changes with the different government administration that's in power. So some are more willing to negotiate these, and some are much more reluctant to conclude these. There's been some studies on the average length of time it takes to negotiate these things, and the average length of time, if you're doing it within the context of a larger comprehensive claim, is 16 years. Although there are some 30% that are currently being negotiated. Some of them have been being negotiated for over 20 years, if not longer. And for standalone agreements, even that can take a decade. So it shows that these are really long processes. As I hinted to earlier, there's also been a number of barriers that have prevented Indigenous groups from really being able to benefit from this policy. So although there has been a comprehensive claim signed with Métis north of 60, and that was with also with the First Nations groups, so it was the Dene Métis treaty in Northwest Territories. Generally, Métis south of 60 have not really benefited, and the government has not been very willing, at least at certain points, to negotiate self-government agreements or comprehensive claims. Also, it's been a challenge for those First Nations that have historic treaties, so the numbered treaties, In particular, those groups are not entitled to and cannot negotiate comprehensive claims, and most of the funding to negotiate those claims come with the comprehensive claim. There are dollars for the self-government negotiations, but they're significantly less. And also, there's been concerns raised by those with historic treaties that the process really doesn't recognize the power or the self-government that is actually embedded, or that the Indigenous groups believe was a part of their original historic agreement. And so anyway, there's really not been many of these agreements at all that have been signed with First Nations that have historic treaties. I've already referenced a moment ago that funding is limited for negotiation. You get less if it's just for a standalone agreement. There is funding, more funding that comes with comprehensive claim negotiation. But this is with strings attached. In fact, the money that's often used to negotiate comprehensive claims is borrowed against the anticipated final compensation. And this sometimes can even be over 50% of what the final compensation would be. So it can be in the millions. I believe there was one claim for one First Nation in British Columbia where the overall claim was maybe 28 million, and they had to pay something like 15 or 14 million in as borrowed money for paying negotiators and lawyers and the whole thing. So that has proven to be a huge barrier as well. And because of the length of time and how few Indigenous groups have concluded these agreements, and I'll just say too that there are something like about 100 negotiation tables that are estimated to be ongoing right now across Canada on both comprehensive claims and self-government claims. But because of the slowness of them, in fact, that led the Harper government to introduce this sort of results-based approach in 2012, which was to pick what they thought to be the best tables, and I don't know how they did that, and then to recommend to other groups something lesser, maybe some type of regime perhaps under the First Nations land management instead of going for a full-blown self-government agreement. And that seemed to me to be really a backward step if what we're aiming towards is for Indigenous people to have greater self-determination and self-government. Okay, so that's the picture of the inherent rights policy and the extent to which it's been implemented to date in Canada. And in just a moment there, a reference that there are some other laws that exist that do give Indigenous groups more self-control over their day-to-day affairs. It may not be a recognition of self-government per se, but it is giving them more practical control over their day-to-day affairs, which is in itself can be a good thing and help incrementally move towards self-government. So that's we do have laws in Canada that do allow this to a certain extent. So, but they're sort of patchwork. It's not comprehensive in all areas. So just to give some examples, the Indian Act recognizes that instead of being under the Indian Act Section 74 to 78 on elections, there can be custom elections, which allow bands to have their own custom election rules, which can either be oral, they can be written, they can be a mix of traditional sort of rules, or they can be more modern or be a hybrid. And the cases have recognized that this can involve passing constitutions and as well as election laws or having oral laws as well. So that has been some recognition of Indigenous groups having greater control over governance issues. Since '85, there's also been recognition of Indigenous control over their membership rules. Not Indian status still, but the Indian Act provides that bands can take control back over membership. And that's led to membership codes and also some bands developing citizenship codes. The Indian Act also has a definition of child that recognizes essentially children who have been adopted through custom adoptions, through Indigenous laws and traditions. So that's another way that recognizes Indigenous laws or control. Then we have the Indian Act bylaws, which it goes from section 81 to 86. There's basically three bylaw areas. 81 sets out a big long list of jurisdictions. I'll come back to that. There's section 83, which is primarily about taxation bylaws and business bylaws. And then section 85 recognizes that there can be bylaws about controlling intoxication issues, sort of banning alcohol, for example, on reserve. So section 81, it used to be that a bylaw to be passed, it would be passed by a band council, but then it had to be sent up to Ottawa, and the Minister of Indian Affairs had up to 40 days to allow or disallow those bylaws. And in 2014, it wasn't really well publicized, but the Harper government did some sort of cleaning up in little ways of the Indian Act, removing some parts of it, some more discriminatory parts of it, but it removed the requirement to send band bylaws up to Ottawa to have them approved. They no longer have to be approved. They can just be passed by band council. Come back to that in a sec. 83 bylaws that are about taxation still have to be approved by the minister. Now the minister basically delegates the process of approving these bylaws to the First Nations Tax Commission. So they go through that organization, and then the intoxication bylaws are approved through a process of community referendum. So 3 different ways that they're approved. So more recently, I've been writing about Section 81 bylaws, and they haven't been used a lot by Indigenous groups up to this point. I think because of the disallowance power, and the minister ended up exercising their disallowance power a lot. They basically sent the message out that they were not going to approve bylaws that looked like any sort of provincial power. So if there was any bylaws over social services or something like that, they generally wouldn't recognize it. Except there was a really cool example in the 80s of a bylaw that was approved by the Department of Indian Affairs, as it then was. And this followed a move by the Spallancheen, now they're called the Splatsin First Nation, who, after experiencing just severe overrepresentation of their children in the child welfare system, like I think almost all the children from their community had been taken into care, and just recognizing that crisis, they protested, they marched, and tried to draw attention to this crisis of all these children being taken. And so with the sort of political attention that they drew, the government of Canada was willing to let them pass their own bylaw for the care of our children. And so this bylaw consists of about 23 provisions, and the key features of it include giving the band exclusive jurisdiction over any child custody proceeding involving an Indian child who is a member of the band, making the chief and council the legal guardians of the children taken into care, and also imposing a principle of rebuilding families whenever possible, meaning that there would be a hierarchy of choices when it comes to placement of child, and the clear priority being to leave the child in the community. So the bylaw itself says that only as a last resort shall the child be placed in the home of a non-Indian living off reserve. And so this bylaw has been on the books, and it's been cited in different court cases in BC, and it's the one sort of exception to the general position that the government had taken for a really long time, not to allow bylaws on sort of this broad concept of health that touches on child welfare, and that might touch on social assistance and other areas, day-to-day areas, right, that the government now sort of controls under program devolution. But going back to the point that the government in 2014 removed the disallowance power, I think that power now does exist again to go ahead and attempt to pass bylaws like that. So in a paper, I have written about how that this is now a possibility, and also how I think that interpretation rules that the courts have taken to bylaws, even passed by municipalities, has tended to be in more recent years pretty broad, recognizing that that municipalities and other governments not just provincial and federal, should be able to pass laws that meet the needs of its citizens, so long as it can be grounded in an interpretation of the power that's given to them. So yeah, I do think that there's lots of room now, and so of using bylaws. But maybe we don't have to work under the Indian Act bylaws. Maybe we are moving more towards a more robust concept of self-government. So I'll come to that shortly, that idea a little bit more. Other sections in the Indian Act, beyond sort of ones that have to relate to health, the bylaws touch on land management, economic life, administration and enforcement of laws. So there can be, arguments for lots of jurisdiction coming out of those bylaws and reading them more broadly than they have been before. Then there's also the First Nations Land Management Act, which was passed in the late 90s, which does allow bands after a community referendum to move into having their own land codes. So they opt out of the land provision parts of the Indian Act, and they have more control over their lands and resources, and can pass things like land codes and matrimonial property laws. And so that gives Indigenous groups some more control. Also, more recently, the Family Homes on Reserve and Matrimonial Interest or Rights Act, in addition to having sort of default MRP rules, also provides that Indigenous groups can pass their own MRP laws. And the First Nations Goods and Services Tax Act also is an example of a law that allows First Nations to take more control over taxation questions about on goods on reserve. So these laws are in some ways good things because they are giving Indigenous groups more control over their day-to-day affairs. But there are some limitations with these laws as well. As I've written in the paper, they tend to be just limited to First Nations on reserve. So there's not sort of similar controls really available for Métis or Inuit. And when it comes to First Nations, my research shows that a lot of First Nations are not taking advantage of a lot of these laws that are out there. First Nations Land Management Act, there's only about 20% of First Nations who have signed on to that law. About 24% of First Nations have taxation laws. Under the new MRP law, there's only about 2% of First Nations who have passed their own laws under that legislation. Although I will note that it's possible under the First Nations Land Management Act to also have MRP laws. So there may be more Indigenous groups with MRP laws than this makes it look like. When it comes to membership laws, which have been around since 1985, there are more Indigenous groups who have taken advantage of this, but still less than half. The only law that has been perhaps used more frequently by Indigenous groups are the custom election rules in the Indian Act. So 56% of bans are custom election bans. And some of the reasons why I might say that there's not the sort of uptake of these laws is, on one hand, lack of awareness. I don't think a lot of Indigenous groups know about the availability of all these laws, and I think for sure that many of their lawyers or whoever's giving them legal advice may not be very aware of these areas as well, because there's not a lot of emphasis yet still in legal education on Indigenous people's rights and the different instruments that are available for them to become self-governing. Also, these laws do impose sometimes some pretty significant restrictions on the exercise of these powers. So, for example, the membership rules only give control over membership. They don't give control over who is an Indian under law. So INAC still controls who is a status Indian, and so that could be a big disincentive for Indigenous people, wanting to take control of that area because it's really limited. And there's lots of places still where there's significant oversight that exercise. It used to be that the minister could disallow Section 81 bylaws up until 2014. Still, for Section 83 bylaws, you have to go to the First Nations Tax Commission. And in some cases, with the First Nations Land Management Act and the MRP law, you have to go get a community referendum in order to make that happen. And that can be pretty difficult in some cases. I know of cases of some bands who have tried to develop their own matrimonial property laws, but have had a really hard time in even achieving 25% quorum, because many of the off-reserve members, because they don't see the application of that law to them, have not been voting, and yeah, that has affected numbers. So some big limitations in these laws, even though they do provide some more control. So taken these laws and also the inherent rights policy, what have they done? What impact have they had on Indigenous communities up to this point? So what you'll see on the screen there is a chart that was prepared by INAC using stats from 1981 to 2011. And INAC tracks something called the Community Wellbeing Index, and it looks at what both for First Nations communities and Inuit communities, what in terms of their poverty and socioeconomic status, where do they stand relative to non-Indigenous people? And this chart tracks that, and you'll see, so the gold line is First Nations, and the blue line is non-Indigenous people. And you'll see that there's been some general increase in sort of well-being across the board in the last 30 years. However, there's been a persistent 20-point gap between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. You'll see that the red are the Inuit, and they have jumped up a little bit above the gold. There's still a big gap. But if you were to ask, why would that be? So for the Inuit, many of whom who were denied sort of recognition by the federal government at first, until a major court case in the 1940s called Re-Inuit affirmed that Canada does have federal obligations to the Inuit, but instead of legislating with respect to them, they used policies instead, and in the more recent era have in effect concluded comprehensive claim with some self-government provisions with almost all the Inuit in Canada, except for one group. And so Inuit have more control over First Nations people generally. There's been more of them who have signed agreements that have some self-government powers. And I think that's what accounts for that difference, that they are above First Nations. Because there is a real obvious link that has been drawn both by the government of Canada recognizes this, as well as academics, that there's a link between self-government and the improvement in Indigenous people's living conditions. So, the practical effect of recognizing self-government for Indigenous people in Canada, is a real clear one. And by not doing it, it's having a real impact on their lives. And in 2014, the UN Special Rapporteur really commented on how the socioeconomic position of Indigenous people in Canada was at a crisis point, and he called it the most distressing or the most jarring manifestation of human rights problems in this country, pointing to the severe socioeconomic conditions of Indigenous people. So the point here is that Indigenous people, not just certainly as a matter of inherent right, but also as a matter of our well-being, need to be self-governing and need to have more control over our lives, need to be self-determining. So some people, because of this, have said, so why do we need to wait for the federal government to do something? Why can't we just do it? Let's just exercise self-government. And I think that sounds great in principle, but really it's not that simple. So first of all, I'd say that some First Nations have tried this, and they've ended up in court. There was one band who tried to arrange their own sales tax model, and they ended up with a hefty bill from the Canada Revenue Agency. In fact, it was in the millions. And the federal court and the Federal Court of Appeal ordered that they had to pay it, and they didn't recognize their self-governing right to develop this system. So there's real risks, right, in just doing it, unless it's an area that no other jurisdiction is going to really fight with you over. But So there's real risks. And the other part of the complexity here is that when it comes to rebuilding governance structures, rediscovering what our laws are, determining what those should be, there needs to be resources available. I'm talking about money to support capacity building within the communities and training and developing legal frameworks and all these sorts of things. So, and that's especially so because of the huge toll that colonialism has taken on our communities. And so there has been loss of, our sense of what our governing structures used to be and what our laws used to be. They're not entirely gone. I'm not saying that at all. But to delve deep into the work that needs to be done, there needs to be support and resources for that. Okay, so as I sort of hinted at the beginning, I do think that we are potentially in a big time of change. There's lots of things that have been happening that I think support that. One is the TRC report, which has been so significant. It calls out the Doctrine of Discovery and points, how it's still underlying so many Canadian institutions and the court's cases on Section 35. And it clearly calls in its calls to action on the government to repudiate the doctrine and to reform any laws, policies, and litigation strategies that continue to rely on them. So it is making that point much clearer than it ever has been made before, and that is getting people's attention. So that might cause some changes in law. It also calls on the governments to reconcile Aboriginal and Crown constitutional and legal orders to ensure that Aboriginal peoples are full partners in Confederation, including in the recognition and integration of Indigenous laws and legal traditions. And the TRC says that reinvigorating our laws and legal traditions is really key to reconciliation. And so that sort of point is starting to really sink in, I think, to people, not just Indigenous people, more. And so that may have a big impact. Finally, the TRC calls on governments to adopt and fully implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People as the framework for reconciliation. And it does so in many of its calls to action, but most directly in Call 43. And let's just talk about UNDRIP and why it's so significant for a moment. So when you look at UNDRIP, the key to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is that, self-determination and self-government are at the core of that document. It calls on the repudiation of all ideas that are based in racist concepts like the Doctrine of Discovery, and it really emphasizes that Indigenous people have the right to choose, right? Going back to this idea of self-determination. And they say that as part of that includes the right to self-government over their local and internal affairs. And then there are a number of other provisions within the UNDRIP that talk about specific control about education and language and health and housing and social programs and economies, as well as lands, territories, and resources and citizenship. And that all of these Indigenous people are entitled to have all of these things reflect their customs, traditions, and laws. And so that's what makes UNDRIP, among other things, really important, as well as including standards like full, free, prior, and informed consent in terms of governments interacting with Indigenous communities. So the other big, factor here, why I think that times are changing, is that we have a government right now who has fully committed to implementing UNDRIP. And currently it has working groups of ministers that are reviewing laws and policies to ensure their conformity with UNDRIP. Canada announced also in November that it's going to be signing on to a private member's bill that was recommended by Romeo Saganash, NDP member, and it's called Bill C-262, an act to ensure the laws of Canada are in harmony with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And, the minister has said that this law won't be the end-all and the be-all. It's still going to require that process of going through all the laws, in Canada and ensuring that they reflect UNDRIP's principles, as well as the government's policies to reflect UNDRIP principles. But this law will do some interesting things. It does state specifically that UNDRIP is, quote, hereby affirmed as a universal international human rights instrument with application in Canadian law, which is a clearer statement, that will be the clearest statement that we have to date. And to this point, UNDRIP has been argued a little bit in the courts, but this affirms it as part of Canadian law. And so we may see, the courts being more willing to interpret Section 35 and other Canadian laws consistent with UNDRIP. So that's a really interesting issue once this becomes law that's going to be raised. And it also more broadly commits Canada to develop an action plan on implementing UNDRIP, and requires Canada, as a matter of accountability, every year for 30 years to report to Parliament about its success in implementing UNDRIP. And so that's going to be a pretty serious requirement in terms of accountability. Now, look, I think there's lots of reasons to be skeptical. This government hasn't been perfect in its track record to date in terms of, even though it said it really wants to, change the relationship. And we've seen from the past that what happens is that governments come up with ideas and they're going to implement something, and then they get replaced by another government. So, and that's especially scary when the government only does things by way of changes of policy. So I do think there is some cause to be cautiously optimistic, especially if some of these changes we're going to start to see them being implemented in law, because it's a lot harder to change once it's implemented in law. A new government can't just come in and say, well, we're not going to abide by any of that, or we're just going to ignore that. So those are some of the reasons why I think that maybe we are on the verge of a new era. Okay, so my last points that I want to touch on are when I've heard people talking about, that we will be moving towards a greater recognition of self-determination and self-government. I've heard primarily more non-Indigenous people, but really scratch their head and say, well, how could we ever do that? Isn't it just so complicated? They can't even imagine, right? And they're like, well, where would you even start? Well, to this, I always say that there is an amazing source out there that has considered pretty much all of these issues about 20 years ago, and it's been sitting around gathering dust since then. But by this, I'm referring to the Royal Commission report on Aboriginal peoples, which came after the Oka crisis, was a 5-year commission of inquiry that looked deeply at the relationship and came up with over 300 recommendations on how to, change the relationship to one of nation to nation. So I want to close my presentation to you by reviewing some of the proposals in RCAP, especially those around self-government, because there were many. In fact, Volume 2, if you really want to, you can find this all online. If you want to go read about RCAP's proposals, pick up Volume 2, find it online. There's an amazing chapter on governance. And I recently wrote an article about how really that should be the starting point of moving towards this relationship that the federal government right now says it wants to achieve. Okay, so just sort of some of the key points on the RCAP self-government proposals. RCAP said that self-government is both guaranteed by the Constitution Act and also by customary international law. And there wasn't UNDRIP then, but UNDRIP clearly recognizes self-government. So that just bolsters RCAP's point. Don't need a constitutional amendment, although to recognize self-government. That's what RCAP said. Although they said it certainly wouldn't hurt, but they said it wasn't necessary to do that. Really, they said that it already exists. It's recognized in international and domestic law, and a bit like the IRP policy, although broader, I would say, it recognizes that there are core areas of jurisdiction and also what they call periphery areas of jurisdiction. But the core areas, they said, are areas of vital concern to the life and welfare of a particular Aboriginal peoples, its culture and identity. And they identified it extremely broadly, right? But it is, all those areas that would be internal to the Indigenous community. And those areas that are on the periphery are those that, potentially impact on other communities and other governments. And in those areas, they say that, self-government over those areas would have to be negotiated. But when it comes to the core areas of jurisdiction, those are just areas where Indigenous people should have the right to unilaterally be able to implement those areas. So they don't need to negotiate big, long agreements for 20 years with the federal government about, having jurisdiction over child welfare or social assistance or land in their communities. So that was a key point that came out of RCAP. And, we've been spending 20 plus years negotiating everything with the federal government under the inherent rights policy. And maybe because it's not gone very far, it's time to, move to something else. So RCAP's proposals were many in terms of how to move to a nation-to-nation relationship. And it wasn't just one thing. It was, they wanted to see the government come out with a new royal proclamation where they would have commit to doing a whole bunch of things, including passing a whole suite of new laws, that would hold government accountable in a whole bunch of different ways. One was an Aboriginal Treaty Implementation Act. Another was a Land and Treaties Tribunal Act, creating a specialized tribunal to hear disputes between Indigenous groups and the government over implementations of treaties and land issues. An Aboriginal Parliament Act. They also recommended that, once all of these acts were implemented, that there should be an act that gets rid of the Department of Indian Affairs, essentially, and implements a new Aboriginal Relations Department Act. Along with that, the RCAP recommended there should be first ministers' meetings with Canada and also with Indigenous people to develop a framework agreement that would sort of set out a number of things, including the new approach that would be taken to treaty negotiation. Because RCAP, a lot like the TRC report, really recommended that the reinvigorating the treaty relationship has to be key, especially if you're going to get rid of the Doctrine of Discovery. But coming back to self-government, as an interim measure, they saw treaties, RCAP saw the treaties as sort of the long-term approach to addressing the relationship. But as an interim step and to recognize self-government sooner than later, they recommended a new legislation called the Aboriginal Nation Recognition and Governance Act. And it was sort of modeled on that, on the Penner Report's recommendations, that there would be a process for Indigenous groups to have themselves recognized as nations. And then once they were recognized as nations, and to do that, they would do things like develop a constitution and a citizenship laws. So once they sort of have these core features of their own governance set up, then they would be able to automatically exercise governance in their core areas of jurisdiction. And and the RCAP took a broad approach to that, approach to core areas. And also it required that along with any act like this, there would need to be funding for such an act to ensure that Indigenous people have sufficient funding. Right now, we know from the Caring Society case that Indigenous services are chronically underfunded. And so RCAP recommended that funding, there would have to be a real consistent amount of funding provided for First Nations to succeed, or Indigenous groups to succeed. Along with this, all of this stuff, basically from the beginning of the process, RCAP said that there has to be a lot of resources and attention put into capacity building. So to support Indigenous governments becoming nations and recognized under this Governance Act, there needs to be a center developed, a transition center, and maybe supported with other universities throughout Canada, but their focus would be on assisting First Nations in becoming self-governing, helping them develop what their their governance institutions are going to look like, helping them revitalize and reinvigorate their laws. RCAP really thought that this was key, and this is something we still don't hear a lot about, and I think that this is really something that any government, if it's serious about moving towards self-government, has to put in place and put the money to where its mouth is in terms of assisting First Nations in becoming self-governing, because we can't do it ourselves, especially with the discrimination and the colonialism that we face. I mean, in order to get up to where we need to be on an equal playing field with the rest of society, Canada has to make amends for those policies that have put us in that position. And so, capacity building and funds for capacity building is really important to that. So that's it. That's my presentation. I thank you for watching it, and if there are other videos on my YouTube channel, and you can also find some of the articles that I have written on a website called SSRN. If you put in SSRN and my name, you will certainly be able to find some of the papers I've written and delve a bit deeper into some of the stuff that I've covered here. Thank you very much.